How does the Fed set interest rates? First, let's start off with bank reserves. Some banks have more reserves than they need. Other banks do not have enough. So, they lend to each other overnight. This is the federal funds market. The federal funds rate is that overnight interest rate. That's what the Fed targets. This is a market where the Fed sets a floor and a ceiling. That's how they control it. Now, they don't directly say the price. Like, they don't put a sticker up and say that's the federal funds rate. Rather, the FOMC creates incentives for banks to shift the supply and demand for loans in this market until we get the desired rate. We're going to go over the mechanism. We will mention 3 primary tools. The first is interest on excess reserves. Remember that the Fed is a bank. Members of the Federal Reserve System hold reserves there, just like you keep a savings account or a checkings account. And so the Fed will pay interest on those reserves. This is going to create a floor, a minimum interest rate in the economy. If you put your reserves with a Fed, it's guaranteed to be paid. That interest rate is guaranteed. You don't need to lend it out. Anytime you lend, there is a slight chance you might not get paid back. But if you put your deposits in the Fed, the risk is literally zero. You're always going to get paid back. The next tool is the overnight repo market. We have a bit of a problem. Not every bank has an account in the Fed, yet they still participate in the federal funds overnight loan market. So how are we going to influence them? Well, the Fed also engages in selling government bonds in a repurchase, shortened to repo, agreement to buy them back the next day at a higher price. This also sets a floor. So we have 2 floor instruments. The repo market made a lot of headlines back in 2019 because there was some haywire with it and the Fed had to make a bunch of adjustments to it to keep it functioning. If you're curious about it, you can do more reading here. The third tool is direct lending. Rather than paying interest on people giving them money, they can give other people money in the form of a loan and therefore receive interest. Because now that we have a floor, we're going to need a ceiling. What keeps the federal funds rate from going too high? The Fed lends to banks directly through the discount window. Like literally, let's say it was like a literal window and it was called discount window and you'd go and you'd get a loan from the Fed there. Why go to the private federal funds market to get a loan when you can go to the discount window and get a loan? So the federal funds private market can't charge a higher rate than the discount window rate because they have to compete with it. Let's put all this together on a diagram. We're going to have 3 people. The Federal Reserve, a first bank, and a second bank. These are the 2 private banks. The first bank is going to give an overnight loan to the second bank. Now, loans aren't free. The second bank is going to have to pay for that. We're going to call this the Federal Funds Interest Rate, or the FFR interest. That's the interest rate the Federal Reserve wants to target, and they'll do that by setting a ceiling and a floor. So, we have reserves. The first bank can deposit reserves with the Fed. You can think about this as a loan. When you give your bank a savings account, you're lending your bank your savings. And the Fed is going to pay an interest rate on this, the interest on reserves. Now look at it from the perspective of this first bank. They can either put their reserves with the Fed or they can lend it to the second bank. Why would they lend it to the second bank? Well, they need to get a slightly higher interest rate. Are they ever going to give a loan to the second bank at an interest rate lower than what they can get on the reserves with the Fed? No, this is a floor. What prevents the federal funds rate from going too high? Enter the discount window. I'm going to fly over here to the second bank. Now, let's think about it from the second bank's perspective. They need a loan. Right now, they're getting a loan from the first bank and they have to pay the FFR. What if they could get a loan from the Fed through the discount window? Well, they'll have to pay it. That's going to be an interest rate. We'll call that the discount window interest. And now they have 2 options. They can either get a loan from the Fed or they can get a loan from the first bank. Will they ever take a loan from the first bank if the interest rate of the FFR is higher than the discount window? No, they're going to take whatever loan has the lowest interest rate. And therefore, the discount window interest rate behaves as a ceiling. We have a floor. We have a ceiling. The federal funds rate, the FFR, is between these 2. That's how the Federal Reserve, a government agency, controls an interest rate between 2 private banks. Well, that was pretty complicated. Does it work? Yes, it does. So on this graph, in the blue, we have the discount window primary credit rate. In the green, we have the effective federal funds rate, and in the red, we have the interest rate on reserve. And we can see they all track each other pretty close. We're going to finish this video off by talking about 3 more tools the Federal Reserve employs to assist the economy. The first is forward guidance. This is literally, they just talk and say what they think they'll do in the future. Remember, interest rates are about future prices. They're about what the price of loans will be a year, 5 years, or 10 years, or even 30 years from now. So simply saying what you believe you'll do in the future will change what those those long-run interest rates will be. This, again, is why the Fed spends so much time crafting their PR statements to be very clear about what their intentions are about the future. This next one's a bit more complicated. We call it quantitative easing. It's a silly name. What do you do when interest rates are zero? I mean, we saw that interest rates got to zero and we're in a deep recession. What else could we do? Now, remember, the Fed was only targeting the short-run overnight interest rate. Can the FFR get lower? Not really. Maybe a negative 0.5% or something like that. We have seen negative nominal interest rates. Japan and Europe had them very, very briefly. You can only do it for a short period of time, and they really can't go that far negative. We need more action. We need even easier monetary policy. The FFR is not the only interest rate in the economy. What if they could bring down longer term interest rates? Well, what about the 30-day ones, the 3-month ones, the year ones, the 5-year ones, the 10-year ones? And so how does the Fed do that? How do they target longer-term interest rates? They buy longer-term assets. Well, what does this mean? Well, they go into the market for, say, mortgage-backed securities. This was a big deal in the 2000s. And they say, hey, we need to make these mortgage rates really low. Well, how do you have a really low mortgage interest rate? Is you have a lot of cash in the mortgage market. And we see that they did that. This graph in red is looking at how many mortgage-backed securities the Federal Reserve own. So what they do is they take the cash and they buy the long-term asset. They take that long-term asset, and that long-term asset is now on their balance sheet. It's now kind of on their records, and that's what we're seeing below in this graph. So starting in 2009, they bought a bunch of mortgage-backed securities in red, and then they kind of held off for a little bit. And then in 2013, they continued to do so, and then they kind of held off, and then they started selling them in 2018, slowly decreasing them. COVID hit. They do the same thing again, peaking around April 2022. Now, mortgage-backed securities are not the only long-term asset they buy. They also purchase treasury securities, especially long-term treasury securities. They always hold some treasury securities on their assets, but what we saw starting in 2010 is they bought more than they had ever purchased before. And again, we see that second period starting in 2013 when they bought even more. What are the quantities that we're talking about? It says million, like it's 2.4 million treasury securities, right? But what are the units? Millions of US dollars. So what's a million of a million? I have to do the math in my head here. 1,000 millions of billions. This is trillions of dollars in assets. Now remember, our economy is huge. We're a $20 trillion economy. And that's just GDP flowing every year. If we look at the total assets in the economy, I mean, you're easily looking at 90 trillion or more. So the Fed is buying more assets, injecting more and more cash into the economy. And they did this to extraordinary levels following COVID to help make sure and prevent any financial crisis happening during that recession. In the period since, to fight inflation, they have been selling these assets, taking that cash out of the market. And what does that mean? A measure of the money supply shows that it went up post-COVID and has been coming down since. So that's quantitative easing. It's a bit complicated, but essentially, instead of just targeting the FFR, they're targeting longer-term interest rates, and they do so by purchasing longer-term assets, injecting as much liquidity and as much cash into the economy as possible. And finally, to bring our discussion full circle, the Fed acts as a lender of last resort. They give out loans to banks to prevent them from collapsing, as long as those banks have solid long-term assets to back up those loans. Now, this idea is old. Very influentially, Walter Bagehot wrote a book in 1873 in England discussing the Bank of England, the central bank across the pond. It's called Lombard Street, a description of the money market. A panic, in a word, is a species of neuralgia, and according to the rules of science, you must not starve it. The holders of the cash reserve must be ready not only to keep it in their own liabilities, but to advance it most freely for the liabilities of others. In other words, lend. They must lend to merchants, to minor bankers, to this man and that man, whenever the security is good. In wild periods of alarm, one failure makes many, and the best way to prevent the derivative failures is to arrest or to stop the primary failure which causes them. The way in which the panic of 1825 was stopped by advancing money has been described in so broad and graphic a way that the passage has become classical. We lent it, said Mr. Harman on behalf of the Bank of England, by every possible means and in modes we had never adopted before. And then he goes on. This particular policy tool is controversial. Ben Bernanke employed it drastically in 2009. He persuaded the European Central Bank to likewise do so, and we prevented a Great Depression. Some, however, are concerned about the long-run implications. If you lend to a bank that has made bad decisions, will this create a moral hazard problem of too big to fail? Will banks in the future take more and more risky decisions knowing that the government government will bail them out. There are ways to prevent this. All of these bailouts, all of these loans of last resort need to come with high interest rates. They need to come with firing the top management. They need to make sure that the taxpayer, represented by the government, is not facing the risk, so that these underlying assets need to be very high quality. In other words, the collateral backing up these loans is very good, thus mitigating the risk to the Fed. Finally, we'll end with a quote from Ben Bernanke that he gave on 60 Minutes. If you have a neighbor who smokes in bed, and he's a risk to everybody, if suppose he sets fire to his house, and you might say to yourself, I'm not going to call the fire department. Let his house burn down. It's fine with me. But what if your house is made of wood and it's right next to his house? What if the whole town is made of wood? Well, I think we'd all agree that the right thing to do is put out that fire first and then say what punishment is appropriate. How should we change the fire code? What needs to be done to make sure this doesn't happen in the future? How can we fireproof our houses? That's where we are now, he said. We have a fire going on.